qualification of jobs and into processes. So when we look at kind of that original slide we had before around kind of what do solutions consultants do, we talked a lot about education and we talked about qualification being in the discovery. This is really focused on that qualification piece, obviously by the name. So here it's trying to look through and understand what are the different options available to automate, and how can you understand, are you headed in the right path, and do you have the right information to help prioritize and think through some of the different processes. So I'm going to give you kind of a light qualitative version as part of this, to give you kind of good questions to ask and why they're important. This will kind of lead you to a questionnaire that we have, which I'll show you as well. There's multiple ways to do this. We also have from our consulting practice, we have a more in-depth guide and a template that people can use, which I can refer you to later on as a follow-up. But the idea here behind this module is to really guide you through some of those initial conversations, especially with people that maybe are very, very new to automation and haven't started their journey as much, or maybe have done some RPA but haven't done much with machine learning. So a lot of this is very similar to probably what you've done before, understanding the as-is to be able to do the to-be. I kind of break this into the 5 different Ds on the screen. So for the as-is, understanding some details, which is what we're going to focus on here, different aspects of the different processes, things like volume and pain points and that sort of thing, to just really understand what the process is at a high level, and then getting deeper into the actual data. So documentation is great if it's available and it's current. A lot of times there might be flowcharts, there might be training manuals. Some of them are going to be more up to date than others, but they might exist and might give some guide. But typically the bottom 2 are going to be the most important. What does the data look like, and how does the data and the screens look in action? So especially when you get to machine learning, and I'll stress this again in the next session when you get to solutioning, the data becomes very important. What are the data points? What is the source look of the data? Is it unstructured data? Is it very structured data? Those types of things are very important. But then it's also important to see them in action. How do people use the data? How do people use the screens? What do they click on? What screens do they go through? What's the thinking process as they're going through the data in the screen? So the end result is to get to a design. We're going to focus on that in the next module. This one's mostly focused around the details, being able to understand and make sure you have the right questions. So as part of the course, I've given you access to this process questionnaire. I'll point it out here in a second. The reason behind this is to do more of a qualitative assessment to try and understand and enable the conversation. A lot of times what we'll do is we'll send this off to the customer with our partners and try and follow up and walk the customer through it. Oftentimes just kind of walking through an example of what they have. A lot of people aren't able to fill out everything, especially not everything on their own. And part of that's because it kind of helps understanding why you're asking the question more so than just, provide a result. Because sometimes not all of the questions are as straightforward. And we're trying to create questions to get to end results, and we'll kind of talk through that. But a lot of times it's kind of moving back and forth, trying to understand what you've heard and maybe converting that into the question as opposed to just sending the questionnaire out. But that being said, let me actually switch to the course so I can point out where you can get access to this. So in the Solutions Consulting course, obviously there's some descriptions and things at the top. Those of you that have access might have already looked through this. But you can see all the individual modules, the PDFs that the ones from yesterday that have been re-uploaded, and the quizzes. But at the bottom here is where I have some supplemental content. So this process questionnaire is an Excel file that I've put here in bullet point number 2. So you can get access to this file and use it to send out to your customers, your teammates, what have you, and be able to use it to facilitate the conversation there. So there's a handful of different pieces on here. If you don't have access to the knowledge base, I guess while I'm here, if you don't have access to the knowledge base, the system requirements before you install, installation guide, these things, capacity planning, those are some of the core pages on the knowledge base that you would need access to. So these are a PDF version, which is probably slightly out of date, but generally in the right direction. So those can at least kind of bridge the gap while you are waiting for your knowledge base access. So I'll maybe come back to this page later on, especially when we get into the assignments. But I did want to kind of point out where this process questionnaire is if you did want to use it going forward. So let me jump back to the slides. So on these questions, I think there's about 19. So I'll kind of go through groups of them. I'm not going to do them all individually, but kind of through groups of them. So the first couple just start talking about the process itself. What's the process name? What's the process overview? This sounds relatively simple, but it actually is very important to get the terms right up front. Because if you refer to something as sanction screening, but the customer refers to it as AML, then there's going to be a lot of confusion as you talk back and forth. So the solution consultant kind of needs to be the translator early on to make sure that the customer terms are what you're communicating with the customer. And then if you have internal terms, internal to your team of a project you might have done similar elsewhere but called differently, making sure that you're able to make that jump of, yes, they call it this one thing, we've done it somewhere else under a different name. Maybe internally you need to adjust your name to be more applicable, or maybe just making sure that it's known what you're talking about. But the overview is also important to get a quick snapshot of kind of how this is being used. So a lot of times when we get into processes, we focus on, go deep into the screens and the data and just start focusing on what it does, and we miss the point of why is this even, why does this even exist? What's the purpose of this process? What's the business problem? What are the objectives? How is it being used? Sometimes even just a couple sentences there can give you enough of an example, enough of an overview to really understand how it's being used and communicate that to your colleagues. So it doesn't have to be a long overview, but just a high level snapshot of why does this thing even exist tends to be pretty helpful. The next few questions I'd say are kind of the pain and history questions. It's good to understand kind of why this might be a candidate for automation. Pain points are important. If there's no pain, you probably don't need to automate. Automating just because it's manual is probably not really the true reason. A lot of times there'll be more things that are going on. Maybe it's too manual, meaning they're not able to scale to the volume, and they aren't allowed to hire more people, but they have increasing volume. So it's good to understand, is it just a volume problem? Is it a quality problem where maybe they keep adding people because the quality is too low, and they took a 4-eye check process and converted it to a 6-eye check process because the quality was too poor? Understanding those types of things. What are the SLAs? How are they reaching those SLAs? Which ones are they missing? Why are they missing them? Those sorts of things. Getting a little bit deeper into more than just it's manual and I want to automate. Really just understanding it at a little bit more depth. And then experience and alternative solutions are useful as well. So has automation been tried in the past? Is it a document-based one that maybe they've tried OCR and OCR didn't work? Why didn't it work? What OCR did they try? What approach did they try? Those types of things can help make sure you don't go down the same path and end in the same results. Because if something failed before, you don't want to do that again. Maybe the failure was just a political reason. Maybe the reason that it failed before was a person that's no longer involved in the process. So maybe it's going to be easy this time around. But just understanding kind of what the history is can be useful. And alternative solutions, alternative discussions is also good to understand. Now, from a WorkFusion perspective, we focus on that to understand where competitors might be involved and how we might need to position. But even just knowing that things have been tried or conversations are in place, different alternatives are there, it's useful to understand that, to kind of consult out what might be the best option, and if they're considering a BPM tool, what they might get from BPM and where WorkFusion might be able to go beyond that, or vice versa. In yellow here in the middle, I have a key point here. What you want to be on the lookout for is getting the hardest, worst, most difficult process that might exist within the customer. So it kind of sounds like that would never happen, like why get the worst thing, but it actually happens all the time. And the mindset is often, if you can do this, if you can automate this process, then you can automate anything. And while that might be true, it tends to not result in the best path forward. So if it's the hardest one, it probably takes a little bit more time to implement. So it might give a bad impression of kind of timeline. It also might be something that, because there's bad timelines, you spend a lot of effort working on it, but you work in such a silo that you miss out on some of the other things that are more important, because even though it's the hardest process, it might not be the most important process. So there might be a lot of eyes on it just from a capability perspective, but it might not really have any ROI. It might not really have much visibility other than the fact that they know it's hard and they just couldn't do it before. And in most cases where this has been the case, where this has been what customers have presented to us, and we've tried to work through it, if we were successful with the process, it tended to be not something they would buy because things moved on. If it was something that that could be solved, a lot of times the promise was a false promise. One example, we had a customer that said, for an OCR use case, if you can solve this use case, then we'll give you all of the OCR work within that particular company. And after that project, there was no other OCR work that was presented, even though that company deals with a lot of documents and a lot of other processes. There was different reasons as to why that wasn't the case. It's just, I'm spending quite a bit of time on that point just to make sure you're not focused on the hardest thing, because typically it's not the best place to start because many different factors, but just something to be on the lookout for, because that's not usually where you want to begin. So current team questions. This is probably more of a business case perspective. And really what we're trying to ask here is how much manual effort's in the process today, typically in a full-time equivalent view, and how much does it cost today? Because if you can know where people exist, you can understand what how much, you can know where people are working, you can understand the rough pay rates, and you can equate to the current cost of the process. So that's kind of what you're looking for. And anytime I've asked those direct questions, I usually don't get the answers that I would like. And anytime that it just doesn't usually go down the clean path of getting answers to those questions. Usually there's ways to back into it, which is why these are the three questions I typically ask: is what's the size of the team? How is the team structured as far as analysts and quality assurance and supervisors? And where's the team located? Just to get a rough idea of where these folks exist. Later on, we have some questions around volume and time, and that's usually where we kind of put these two together to get to those effort level estimates. The team structure is important because a lot of times people will focus only on the first level operators within the process and forget that they have a whole quality assurance arm that are also kind of doing similar work. They're just doing it slightly differently or with a slightly different goal. And those people as well can be part of your end-to-end process because you're expecting to pull in the end-to-end view, which is beginning to end, which includes QA within the process in most cases. If you ask these questions, sometimes you get misleading information, which is why you can have to triangulate this. A lot of times if you say FTEs, people will give you the large team size, and then as you ask more questions, you realize that's not actually what the size is. There was an example with a bank we were working on a few months ago, and they had given us a process where it was a loans process, and they had said that there's 60 FTEs. People doing this in North America, full-time, fully dedicated. And as we walked through it, that number went from 60 down to 40, down to 30, down to 20, down to 12 by the time we actually got enough information. So early on, we got some example of some indicator that there probably was a big business case. But as we dug deeper, we realized that that was not a real number, not a real figure, just because of the as they talked through it, it just wasn't actually the people that worked in that process. So it made that process less appealing because it was one where it actually had a couple different aspects to it, and the scope was, it wasn't a small scope, it was achievable but not small, and the business case just wasn't quite there at this point in time. Questions so far? So the data itself, I'll touch on this more in the next module as well, because when you get into machine learning especially, the data becomes very important. but it is key to understand what's the data, what are the inputs going in, what are the outputs coming out, and what are the steps in between. So if the data is structured in a form in RPA or unstructured in a document, it's good to understand what this data is and how you can use it. Same thing with the goal might be updating a system with a series of data points. The goal might actually be to generate a file in the end. It really depends on what you're looking to do, but you need to understand what the data format is, what the expectation is, and how it's going to move through. If it's simple RPA, maybe it's just in this form, collect these handful of fields and paste them into this other form in this other system, which is kind of the clean, simple way. But a lot of times there's additional transformation, there's reference data, there's other aspects to consider. So making sure you have that all covered is important. Volume questions as well. So with the volume, typically you're going to have high volume if you're looking to automate, but that ends up not always being the case. So a lot of times we've disqualified processes because even though it was painful, there really was no value behind it. There wasn't a lot of volume. And volume becomes very important with machine learning because you need a lot of examples to learn from. Now, there are ways that we're trying to work around low volumes of data to be able to kind of prove out machine learning. But if you have a process that only has a couple hundred documents over the last 5-10 years, it's probably not something that's a good fit for machine learning because there just isn't that much ongoing volume. Maybe it could work. It really depends on the use case. But a lot of times we're looking at things that are more like hundreds a day or thousands a day to really justify machine learning. And seasonality is important here as well. The volume consistency and the data volume outlook, because a lot of times you'll have spikes in the data set, and it's good to understand from a planning perspective of how much throughput you need, maybe how much RPA access you can expect, or how other processes should be scheduled together. But also understanding from a resourcing perspective, because if there's 5 FTEs in the process, but actually on the most important days, there's 10 FTEs because they pull people in from a different team, that's also good to understand from a business case perspective, but also from kind of an expectation from the automation. Handling time, SLA quality, these, at least the first two are probably things that you typically come across, especially in maybe RPA journeys. How much time are people spending on transactions, and what are the SLAs that are the process is bound to? Those are pretty common. They're also very useful for getting back to that business case, because if you have the average handling time and you have the expected volume, you can actually compute the FTEs relatively quickly, and a lot of times that's where those numbers really come from. Quality might be one that you haven't spent as much time with, and this really comes into play, especially when you get into machine learning, of how you're looking to use it. Because with RPA, the quality metric is usually you get it right, like you define it to be correct every time it goes through, and since you're creating rules, then that's how it moves through. And that's fine, and that's perfect, and that's how you do RPA with WorkFusion as well. However, especially when you get to machine learning, quality is a little bit different. So you're no longer defining prescriptive deterministic rules. You're now letting the machine learn and understand how it can get to similar results. And this will then tie into how people do the work today as well. The average person, you can see it kind of in the middle here, probably should bold that. The average person is about 90 to 95% accurate, meaning the average person is wrong about 5 to 10% of the time. So a lot of customers might not agree with that figure, but actually across many processes, across many customers, and across many different data types and problems, that number has been pretty consistent for the individual person. But a lot of processes, especially in the banking and insurance, where you might have very important SLAs where they might want or claim 99% accuracy, high 99% accuracy, or even it's perfect. While that might be somewhat true, typically to get there, it's not just one person that's being relied on. A lot of times it's multiple people, 4-eye, 6-eye checks, maker-checker models set up in place to be able to achieve that high level of accuracy. Excuse me. So keep that in mind when you're solutioning this. a lot of times if there is a high level of quality, look for the multi-tier process, look for an understanding of how that's really being achieved. Because typically within your solutioning with this, you'll want to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. And if the machine learning is getting 98% accuracy and it's compared against a single person, the machine's probably more accurate than that individual person. So things to think about as you're moving through it. So I think 3 more here. So systems and sources. A lot of the times with especially RPA, you've probably talked through this quite a bit. Where does the data come from? Where's the data going? Those sorts of things. Yesterday we talked a little bit about RPA calculators. I didn't dig that up yet, but I'll provide that as a follow-up. If you have systems and sources that are more challenging, you have something that's behind Citrix, something that's behind that maybe is in a mainframe, those are probably going to take more time and effort than something that's in a publicly accessible website that's accessible via modern Google browser, Google or Google Chrome, or even more maybe headless browsers that you can get access to. So just understanding the nuances of the different systems, obviously important. I think with RPA, you've probably focused quite a bit on that, so I won't go too deep into that here, but it's good to kind of list this out and understand where the data comes from. Success criteria is important. Some might say it's the most important piece, but it's also very difficult to achieve. I'm not asking a question, 1 sec. In terms of automating as-is processes, do you see firms automating the 4i checks as well? So yes, I definitely see firms automating the as-is 4i checks, but the most typical approach is to focus automation on the first set of eyes and leave the second set of eyes manual. Now you might be able to impact that second set of eyes. So if you're putting them into this end-to-end process, and like we had yesterday where people, when people are engaged, all they have to do is highlight as opposed to key in all the information, you might be able to make that person more efficient. But typically when we're looking at kind of those 4i checks, there's a way to automate and significantly impact that first set of eyes. And then you have more, you can find ways to maybe make that second set more efficient, but you're probably expecting it to be 100% manual, but you still might be able to impact the level of effort they have to expend. So what that looks like is if you have a process today that's a 4i check, and maybe the first set of eyes they spend 3 minutes, and the second set of eyes they spend 2 minutes. If you're able to remove 60–70% of the effort from the first set of eyes, you're cutting that average time frame from 3 minutes down to, I don't know, 1 minute. We'll say you cut out 2/3. And then the second set of eyes, let's say you don't actually get, it still remains manual, but that 2 minutes you've cut down to 90 seconds. Now you've cut something that used to take 5 minutes, and you've cut it down to, what did I say, 1 minute plus 90 seconds, so 2.5 minutes. So you've gotten 50% overall impact, even though you've really only automated in that first set of eyes, and the automation for the second set is just making them more efficient. So there's just different ways to think about it, but yes, a lot of the processes that we focus on are those 4i check processes. So for success criteria, just talk on this one a little bit more. You need to have a view and a goal of where you're headed, but a lot of times that might be a slight moving target, just because maybe the people involved haven't gone through automation before, maybe they're unsure of what they're looking to achieve, maybe they can't define it up front. So there's somewhat of an iterative approach to what this view is. So that's why I say it's not an easy ask to get to it, but it's still something to push for. Whether it's directly saying we need success criteria so we can put it in the SOW, or it's more we need success criteria to figure out if we're moving through cleanly and correctly, and being a little bit softer about how you're asking the question. It depends on who you're working with and how the teams come together. So it is something to push for, it is something to try and achieve. Sometimes it's a little elusive and it might take a few iterations to get through it. Maybe you have to do some work before you can really get to that end goal and understand what's possible. And then the final one here is kind of the information security question, which tends to be kind of a yes/no answer. But this helps understand from a from a infrastructure perspective, what kind of systems can you use? Because a lot of banking and insurance space will be in a on-premise situation. However, a lot of them are also transitioning into maybe private AWS offerings or some other type of infrastructure. So if you have very sensitive data, they might have to be on-prem. But if you have, especially maybe even for a POC, some way to get easier, lighter data, you might be able to have a more flexible infrastructure and avoid installation and procurement of servers early on, because maybe you're able to work with non-sensitive or redacted data and still get the results that you're looking for. So what you're trying to achieve through all of this is really trying to get a good understanding of the use case. I've kind of summarized this into 5 things that by the end of this you should thoroughly understand about the process as you're communicating it with the rest of the teams, as you're getting started on projects and pulling in resources to assist. The things that you really need to understand is context as to why it's even done, data requirements as to how does the data move from step to step, what's the input at the beginning, what's the input, how does the data change in the middle, and what are you trying to do at the end? What's the level of volume, just to make sure you have an understanding of what's coming through this, what's moving through. What the real pain is in the process, and why, not only why is this process done, but why do you want to automate this process? And then the system sources of where data is coming from. So this is kind of a subset of those previous questions, but I'd say these are the most important ones to really understand thoroughly as you're looking to move through your automation journey. And you'll see this within the solution document we'll talk through a little bit later. You'll see how these start coming into play and how we kind of focus on each of these. So having gone through all of this, kind of the next thought is, okay, what if I have a combination of these? Some of the customers on the call probably have a full book of work. Many of the partners here, you probably have many customers you work with where they have a portfolio of processes and they need to understand how to pick the right one to work with. So I'll give you a couple of different views here, and I have a more detailed view I can provide as a follow-up if you would like. So this is kind of an initial scoring system that you can look through. After you've captured all of the data in the first few steps, these are ways you can kind of apply points to each one of these to understand which one might be the best place to start. Things like scope, impact, sustainability, these types of things are going to give you high numbers, high scoring for this criteria. And then at the bottom, you can see things like data privacy might be a negative. Not that something that can't be done, just something to consider that might make this process maybe not the best one to start with. Organizational complexity, technical complexity, these sorts of things. So as you're thinking through this is one way to look through maybe the 3 to 5 or 10 to 15 or 50 different processes that you have to kind of think through and score them and get to some idea of where you might want to start and how you might find ones to focus on. Now, some of it's focused on what's the value of the automation, but then the other part is really focusing on the ease of automation. So we have put together this 2x2 as one way to think of it. I think we have a few variations of this, but this is the one I use. Of a lot of what I've been focusing on in the past few questions is trying to understand the value of the automation. How many people, what's the potential impact, that sort of thing. But as we talked a little bit yesterday, what are the key factors that you try and understand to figure out, is this something easy or difficult to automate? You want to find areas that have potential quick wins, but you also want to make sure you're addressing strategic and areas of focus. So if I plot a few use cases on here, just kind of some example titles here. One second. Sorry for that. If you have something that doesn't have much value, have something that's going to be very hard to automate, obviously that's going to be in your lower left-hand corner of things you just don't want to address. If you have something that's going to be relatively easy to address, that provides quite a bit of value, something like invoice processing that comes up quite a bit, then that's maybe where you want to start. That might be your area of focus from a starting point. But some areas maybe you want to start with strategic, some areas maybe you want to start with the quick wins. I think a lot of people, especially in the RPA space, are very much focused in the quick wins category. They find a lot of small use cases where they can drive a little bit of impact, or in some cases a lot of impact, and try and scale it that way, oftentimes from a power user model. So maybe a lot of customers have already solved quite a bit in the quick wins area, and now they're looking to focus more on the strategic and the areas of focus. Could be some customers haven't started at all, so they might want the quick wins first. Others really want this focus area to address first, and then they'll get to the strategic one as they get more comfortable and familiar with how the software works for their organization. So again, these are guidelines. This is a 2x2 to help organize thoughts. Ease of automation is could be identified as efforts, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It could be a little bit different, more kind of different way to think through it. And then value of automation is kind of that overall impact, but also it might not just be FTE reduction. It could be other things like a reduced amount of compliance issues. It can be other aspects, SLA breaches, that sort of thing that might come into the value beyond just a headcount focus. So that's the approach we kind of take to understand processes with our customers and working with our partners to understand how we get started, asking the right questions to pick between a handful of different options.